Welcome to Learning Aloud, a podcast from the Organizational Dynamics community at the University of Pennsylvania, produced to inspire purposeful leadership practice and transform organizational experience. I am your host, Stephen G. Hart. One of the many pleasures I get from teaching on Penn's Organizational Dynamics program is the opportunity to facilitate an independent study with our students. Such an occasion occurred for me in the fall of 2021. I was invited to work with two of our terrific grad students, Dajana Walters and Keren White, as they conducted research and prepared a final presentation on women's well-being in the workplace. Both Dajana and Keren did an outstanding job with their research and with their final presentation last December. I asked them to join me on the Learning Aloud podcast to share their study with our audience. Before we listen to our conversation, here's a little background on both Dajana and Keren. Their full bio is included on the show notes for this episode. Dajana Walters has worked as a nonprofit professional for more than 15 years and has international experience in arts programming, event management, and training. She has worked as an intercultural communications and human rights trainer at the UNESCO Initiative Center in Poland, a public programs manager at the Jewish Museum in Philadelphia, and a student film festival director at Swarthmore College. She has an MA degree in journalism and social communication from the University of Wrocław, Poland, and is completing her capstone for the MPhil in Organizational Dynamics at Penn. Her research is focused on the experience of the second-generation millennial East Asian American women in corporate America. Keren White is the Executive Director for Strategy, Engagement, and Campaign in Penn's Central Development and Alumni Relations Office. Previously, she served as Executive Director of the Chester Fund, a nonprofit organization supporting education programs in the city of Chester, PA. Before this, she was a management consultant with Geneva Global, a philanthropic consulting firm specializing in international development and global health. Keren has a BS in archaeology and anthropology from the University of Oxford in the UK, and she's completing an MS in organizational dynamics at Penn. Her capstone thesis is focused on women managers' well-being. I hope you enjoy listening to our conversation. Well, Dajana and Keren, it's a pleasure to see you again after the fall term we spent together doing an independent study on women's well-being in the workplace. And I wonder, let's start with you, Dajana. What drew you to want to do this as an independent study?
Hi, Steve. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I'm particularly interested in this topic from the gender bias perspective. I'm very drawn to the impact of gender bias in the workplace, how the way we perceive women and men and their, stereotypically viewed characteristics influence our decision-making process at work. I also like to, and I think that it's absolutely necessary to look at the workplace through the intersectionality lens when we look at the experiences of women of color and acknowledging how unique their experiences in corporate America and beyond corporate America, and how this different perspectives and understandings of their experiences shape their career paths and choices.
Great. So, Keren, what drew you to wanting to do this form of independent study?
Yeah, so thank you also for having me here with Dajana. I think I really became interested in doing it, especially at this time last fall when we decided to do the study, because we were emerging from fully remote period of work during COVID. And for me, as a woman in a management position, overseeing a lot of women, I had noticed patterns much more strongly than maybe I had noticed prior to the pandemic. emerging around the burdens of caregiving for women who are also working. So I think caregiving and the impact of caregiving really struck me and became something I wanted to look even more closely at.
Yeah, we'll probably dig into a little bit of the impact that COVID had on this topic in just a second. But I was really impressed with the quality of the research that you did around this topic. And before you formulated your presentation for the final that you did on this topic, the quality of the research I thought was really exceptional. Can you tell us a little bit about how you went about this research and what were some of the highlights of that? Dajana, let's start with you.
Sure. We spent a lot of time on our research, I have to say, and we very diligently went through all the reports that were available online, done by different organizations that looked very closely at women's well-being and women's conditions in the workplace before and during the pandemic. So we had a great comparison, like how the circumstances actually have changed specifically for women. I looked because of my capstone and my focus on the experiences of women of color in corporate America. I actually looked very closely at how it really impacted women of color specifically. And of course, there is really no surprise in the findings that basically there's basically like one unison voice saying women of color are more impacted than any other group really in the workplace. They go through trauma, they go through racial battle fatigue, specifically Asian American women who went through the whole, well, some will actually argue that it's really not new, but 1 in 4 Asian American women experienced a traumatic experience during the pandemic because of the anti-Asian hatred that started popping up due to the COVID. Still, some will argue that this is nothing new, and Asian American, both men and women, go through traumatic experiences associated with their race for really centuries. But the COVID related hatred was one of the new circumstances that really impacted the community very much so. Yeah, so that's kind of like that's kind of what I concentrated on in my research, to kind of be very clear and see what kind of specific implications women of color have to face in the workplace, both during the pandemic, but also before the pandemic.
And Keren, what did your aspects of research discover, and where did you go looking for those resources?
Yeah, so I think this whole topic of looking at women's well-being is so incredibly rich. There were so many different directions to go. As Dajana said, just beginning with some of the industry reports like Deloitte and McKinsey, and we were exposed to all these different threads. And so also because I was trying to do my capstone on women's well-being, women managers' well-being, I wanted to dig deeper into some of those threads in the academic research. So some of the things I looked at were sort of the history of caregiving and how that's impacted women's lives at work, and it related but different emotional labor, which there's a long history of academic research back to the, I think, 50s. And I think what really struck me about some of that research is how the situation hasn't changed as much as you might think, as we look at the situation, 70 years later for women at work.
Yeah, it was an excellent job of digging through the literature and looking at what previous people had done. One of the things that you emerged from this was you came up with a definition of what well-being is for women in the workplace. You recall that part of the conversation, and how would you define well-being for women in the workplace?
Well, I think we said that workplace well-being relates to various aspects. So to all aspects of working life, including the physical environment and safety at work, but also how workers feel at work. So the climate and culture and how they're treated and the psychological aspects of being at work.
Yes, it was a pretty sort of well-rounded composition of different states, wasn't it, of mind and actions and so on, and of that. So some of the things you came up with were gender bias, reproductive health issues, the caregiving dilemma, as you said, emotional labor, and then obviously the intersectionality of all that. Tell us something about some of those areas. Let's start with gender bias. What did you discover around gender bias that's important for us to know?
Gender bias, when we think about gender bias, some people might say, oh, we've been there, we've done it, we don't have to worry about it anymore. Well, many people, including Claudia Goldin, who is one of the, I think, like most prominent researchers on this topic. She's a Harvard professor of economics, and she came up with this 4 stages of how women basically came to be in the workplace. And obviously, when we look at the history, which starts basically in like late 19th century, we definitely see the progress, right? We back then, only 7% of married women were part of the workforce. The being employed was something considered dangerous, like maybe not really something for well-educated or well-established families. Women were not supposed to do that. Then when we are going to the 1950s, we have already almost 50% of married women who are in the workforce. So we have we can see the progress, and then we go to the peak of the women's participation in the workforce, which is 1999, and then we are talking about 60% of women who are in the workforce. So we definitely see progress there, and we see that women, if they want to, they can participate in the workforce. The problem is what kind of conditions and how they are treated in the workforce right now, right? We have problems with gender biases in terms of like, if woman is too aggressive, well, that's not great. But if woman is not aggressive enough, that's not great either, because she cannot be a leader then. There is like the standard, this double standard for men and women, what kind of leaders they can and should be. And it kind of like, I think, creates this catch-22 for women, when if they kind of break the gender prescription, which is basically, like the communality that we talk about, which is be kind, be caring, be understanding, be patient. When they break this prescription for a typically male gender prescription, which is agency, so be confident, be decisive, be independent, then they get into trouble. And that also, what this catch-22 really talks about, is that they actually get into trouble, and many of them end up being sexual harassment victims in the workplace. So there is really like, it seems like that we are in the 21st century, and there is still like no win-win for women, like there is like no really a way for us to be good at what we do, but also like follow the path that someone else told us to follow. And I think that this is the trap that many women find themselves in the workplace in terms of like gender biases specifically.
Keren, what would you add to that?
I guess related to bias, but very specifically, something I discovered more about, because it wasn't something I initially was going to focus on, but when I got into the research was really interesting, is reproductive health issues. So I think when we talk about that, people think a lot about just childbirth, just having a baby at work. In the early 1900s, women weren't even allowed to work in most jobs because of their, I think this report said, childbearing potential. And it wasn't until the 60s that kind of discrimination was even questioned. And then it wasn't even until 1993 that the Family Medical Leave Act happened, allowing women and men to take time off after having a baby. And it's still unpaid. So I think that's a tremendous physical barrier that women can do nothing about. I think I was really struck by how impossible the situation is around reproductive issues to truly level the playing field. I mean, it will take extraordinary interventions and intentionality to create fairness around that situation, just the fact that women have babies. But even beyond pregnancy, something I had not even thought of, and maybe because I'm not of that age yet, but I will be, is menopause. Menopause is a huge health issue for women. It impacts every single woman who reaches that age, which typically is the 50s. And we don't talk about it. And there are not exceptional circumstances built into workplaces to allow women to take the time they need, get the help they need, not do so well at work for a little bit, maybe because they're suffering. I think women just have to go through it and not even talk about it.
Yeah, another thing that you found, I think, when you did your study around the gender bias aspect was the disparity in the wage gap. There was a significant difference there. And for all the reasons that you've cited and thinking, and it's the reasons why that might be. What did you discover when you looked at the wage gap history?
Gender wage gap is something that has been closely looked at since 1979. So the first data, from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics says that women earn 62.3 cents per $1 earned by white, non-Hispanic men. And the numbers, of course, decrease. I mean, of course, not really, of course, but they decrease through the decades, but it actually takes more or less 10 decades every time we are hitting the new number. So 1989, I don't know what's going on, but something weird is going on. Should I repeat it? What I just said?
Oh, yes, yeah. Start over with that thought again.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So I will start from
1989. Jump in
1989. Okay. In 1989. Okay. So in 1989, the gap was 70.1 cents per $1. 2004 was 80 cents per $1, and now we are in 2022 and we still are at 83 cents per $1. So again, is there a progress? Of course there is a progress. Should we be still talking about it? Absolutely not. It should be the time when we don't have these conversations, and again, when you look, as I obsessively do, look through the intersectionality lens, it looks even worse for women of color. When we look at, like Latinas, it's 57 cents per $1. When we talk about Native American women, it's 60 cents per $1. Black women, 64 cents per $1. Asian American and Pacific Islander women, it's depending on the statistic, is 83 or 100 actually one. Which means basically over $1 per man's dollar. But we're still talking about this wage gap, and it actually exists according to the reports that we went through with Keren in 94% of occupations in the US, which sounds pretty incredible given the fact that we are again talking about 2022.
Yes, it is a phenomenal thing that in this day and age that we have such disparity there. Keren, what would you like to add to that analysis?
Well, one thing that struck me, since I was just talking about mothers having babies and coming back to work, is the data that shows that new mothers, their earning trajectory goes down in the next 2 years after they come back after having a baby, whereas a new father, his earning trajectory goes up in the 2 years after becoming a new father, which is part of the problem.
Yeah, you also pointed out that the impact of all of this and that the burdens and the responsibilities also create a psychological impact and a bias for women as well. What are some of the things you identified there in the psychological realm? I think one in particular that I saw was about how women are less likely to receive specific feedback. Those types of areas that impact the performance on the job and the ability for a woman to feel that she is part of an organization's important strategic imperatives. I thought that was an interesting spillover to what it is that you discovered on around the impact that women, additional impacts that women have to deal with.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of research into feedback. There have been some really interesting studies, and women tend to get feedback that references their personality, whereas men tend to get feedback that's about their performance of tasks, which is just very clear bias. And the impact is that women are more likely to hear things that are personally critical, regardless of how well they're doing with their work. And the data also shows that women tend to be more upset by that kind of feedback. So not only do they get more of that personally hurtful feedback, but then they're more upset by it. They're upset for longer. And that translates into feeling less good about work.
Yeah, the self-esteem level goes down, doesn't it? And those types of things are and their engagement level in what they're doing and the added stresses all have a consequence into the workload. Let's talk a little bit about some of the other the caregiving dilemma. Keren, you specifically referenced that here. What did you discover in the deeper level in the caregiving dilemma?
Yeah, so it might not be a surprise. I think there's a lot of talk about this, that women just tend to be more oriented toward caregiving in all aspects of their life. Not to say that there aren't many very empathetic, caring men who are taking care of children and others, but in terms of the data and on balance, women are shown to naturally go in that direction. And they also are putting many, many more hours per week into unpaid caregiving of children and elderly. So you have women effectively, they can be in a high-paying job and they're coming home and they're doing, a second shift, as it were. So the impact is just enormous on how exhausted women are. And what they can give to their jobs, which then can impact what kinds of careers they can go into and impact how much they can pursue, even possibly earning, because of the choices they have to make. It's always a trade-off. So there are so many things we could dig into around it, but that's some of the top thoughts.
Well, one thing I had to pick up on, Dana, maybe you can handle this one. What was all of the things that Keren just said are constant burdens that women have carried for a long time, but how did the pandemic exacerbate that for women?
That definitely didn't. The pandemic definitely didn't help. We see the impact of caregiving dilemma across the board. Women were losing their jobs and quitting their jobs over the caregiving dilemma. Many women of color specifically had a burden of taking care of their elderly and of their children. I'm talking mostly about the Latinas and Black women who usually pre-pandemic times many times are main caregivers in their families, and also their families tend to be multi-generational when they have to take care of not only children but also the elderly at the same time. And the pandemic definitely made them rethink their priorities in life and how they want to go through the pandemic, as professional women. And many of them basically decided that this is it, I cannot do both and deal with the pandemic at the same time. And many of them quit their jobs, and many of them were forced to quit their jobs because they just couldn't handle both at the same time.
Keren, what would you like to add to that?
Yeah, just the issue of, in particular, daycares closing, which isn't rebounding fully. There is a shortage of daycare workers. Many daycares have not even reopened. So it's literally, it's a structural issue. You know, we don't have government provided childcare, so we have to figure it out. And so some women just can't come back to work. They have nobody to take care of their under 5-year-old children. And I did have another thought that maybe will come back to me.
One of the things I'd like to transition a little bit then, because the research clearly depicts that the burden that women experience in the workplace and the threat to their well-being is a very profound one, based on what you discovered, the gender pay gap, the extra burdens, the way in which women can be treated in the workplace. But you also offered some hope a little bit on what people could do about that. I want to explore just in the next part of the conversation, what were some of the things that you are suggesting are ways in which women can cope better with this reality of the workplace. And you talk about it in terms about self-care, and let's pick up on that theme a little bit before we dig into what organizations can do about it. What did you come up with in terms of what should be women's response to this burden that they feel?
I think a lot of these things won't sound new to people, but it's remarkable how consistent, if you talk to women about how they're coping, these are the things that come up, which I think shows that they work. But basics like make time for yourself. I mean, exercise, diet, sleep, they're really, really important. They impact your mental health and your ability to even make the right decisions to take care of yourself in other ways. So I think those are basics that if women in difficult situations, working really hard, can at the very first step take care of those things, that was what we recommended. And then there are some practical steps that you can take, just which are more planful and about organizing to get the kind of support networks and help that you need to ease those practical challenges like childcare and commutes and hours. And then we talked about advocacy. So really being planful about how you maybe approach your own workplace with ideas that could be helpful, which, you know, is also not possible everywhere. So part of that work is assessing if you're in the right place. Are you in the best place for yourself? Sometimes maybe the tough decision is that you need to work somewhere else.
Dajana, speak to a little bit more about the importance of this network, because my sense of it might be that women who face these burdens in the workplace might be reluctant to open up about the experience that they have. How important is it for building the network that Keren talked about, and what's the impact of doing such a great job of building a network? What happens?
We are always told, like when you enter the workforce, build up your network. And, like in terms of like building your career, it's very important, but I think it's equally, if not more important, to build up your network around people who understand you, who go through the same exact challenges. I think that women are generally pretty good about connecting with each other and being each other's advocates. I think that this is especially crucial for women of color and generally employees of color who are actually seeking for understanding and platform to be heard and seen. And I think that that's also where the leadership roles come to, to play. I think that this is also a very important moment for the leaders to acknowledge that this kind of platform should be created for people and for women specifically, so they actually feel safe to address their issues and challenges, and to know that they will be addressed with respect and kindness and curiosity, because I think that this is one of the biggest challenges in any organization, is that people don't feel comfortable sharing their challenges with people who are above them. When there is like any power dynamic in the organization, I think that there is always this apprehension about, oh, should I actually say anything? And I think that this is like a great place for leaders to be like, oh yeah, this is totally okay. This is a safe space. Please tell me, like what your problems are. And there is actually a lot of conversations about, so-called informed leadership, when leaders are actually attentive and open to hear about people's problems, emotional problems, like any scars, any issues that people might have, any baggage really that people bring to their workforce and their workplace. There should be a platform for them to share with one another, and I think that leaders should be part of this platform.
So it seems that organizations can help this situation considerably if they have some thoughtful strategies, create safe places for women to network and learn from each other and be mutually supportive. What are some of the other things that organizations specifically need to do in terms? Is it HR policies? Is it flexible work, more flexible work environments? Is it more remote working? What are some of the critical answers from an organizational perspective that we need to see more of?
So I think there are a lot of things that organizations can do. And some of them, there's indications that organizations know they have to do it, but I think it's just going to take some time. The good news is that a large percentage of organizations indicate that they understand well-being is really important, and there's an increased recognition of mental health. So I think airing those things publicly, and as Dajana said, creating safe spaces to create a culture where vulnerability and needing help is okay, is really important to help women who are juggling many, many things to feel that they can go into a workplace and be themselves. I think that one of the things we looked at, certainly in a lot of industries, is a celebration of overwork. And that makes it impossible for people, men or women, to balance family life and work. So I think that to get at that requires policies, as well as leadership, setting an example. I think one of the things we discovered in our research was a mandatory policy. I think it was in Barcelona, where they had made it illegal to contact their employees outside of work hours, which is quite extreme. But that sort of thing, mandating vacation, just close the office if people aren't taking vacations. There are things that organizations can do on that front.
And I think you discovered that we have a very high percentage of women now in our workforce, right? So it's clearly a very important source of talent for organizations. So what's the implications for organizations that don't pay attention to this dynamic? Dajana, can you answer?
Oh, yeah, sure. So there is, like when the pandemic hit, I think that the reports were basically saying that over 1 million women basically left workforce, and some of them came back. There are like good news that some of them came back and managed to, to be part of the workforce again, but some of them didn't because they are still struggling and couldn't find a way to make it work for themselves. I think that first of all, women are actually proved to be great managers and leaders, and so that's like a big red flag for us here, that we are basically losing great leaders who could make actually really meaningful and impactful changes in our organizations, but they are basically leaving. I think that there is also a huge implication in women's mental health, which obviously, at the end of the day, impacts organizations, and they will be losing them too. I hear more and more about women who just cannot handle their work life, like balance situation, and they are just like leaving and cannot really be part of their organizations as much as they would like to be. I think that one thing that I would like to mention is that I think that there is like a play. I mean, I think that there should be like a space for leaders to really learn what's going on and to be attentive to all the red flags that are basically flying in front of their noses all the time. Because I think that when they learn and that when they understand the implications and the situation that women have to face on a regular basis, then there will be, well, at least I hope, there should be the next natural step of making significant changes to the situation. And I think that that's actually a problem that I see in many organizations, that there is like really no space for leaders to learn that, because either they don't have time for it or it's not treated as a priority. And I think that this challenges and these issues are coming up, but no one is really addressing them in a timely manner, because no one is really, like treating them as something that should be managed right away.
Keren, I see that there are real cost implications for this impact in the workplace. What were some of the things you identified there in terms of real cost to organizations when it comes to not being attentive to these issues?
Yeah, so not to contradict Dajana, but I wanted to look up that stat. She said over 1 million women left the workplace in COVID. 3.5 million women left in 2020. I mean, I think that's just phenomenal, and it's many more than men who left. And just that loss of employees, having to rehire or lost productivity costs. Economists, I'll throw a big number at you, but economists predict that the exodus of women from the workforce will remove $885 billion out of the US economy over the next 2 years. So that was a stat from 2021. And the global GDP will see a $1 trillion shortfall by 2030. So big consequences for the organizations, as well as the women who are giving up work.
Right. So what else would you like to see happen in order to create more attention around this in the workplace? What more must be done and can be done, both in the short term and the longer term?
Well, I think Dajana mentioned it. I think leaders, absolutely, it's critical that leaders get behind this and make a stand and push for structural changes, policy changes. It won't happen without leadership.
Dajana?
Yeah, I also feel that, yeah, as important the leaders are, I think that, again, kind of like piggybacking on what Keren mentioned before, is that this advocacy piece, right? Like, I think that we should really advocate for ourselves and for each other. And I think that, like creating safe spaces, again, this will not happen without leaders' help. But I think that some kind of like, grassroots, initiatives within organizations that can kind of like push the movement forward would be definitely also very helpful. But again, yeah, without leaders, we really cannot make any, in terms of at least policies, we cannot really make any impactful changes.
And I can't leave this conversation without putting in my usual plug that all my friends know me for the government to be more involved with providing childcare. If we solved the childcare issue and we just supported young families better, then women could get back to work.
Well, I'd like to ask each of you, as we conclude our conversation, to tell me how you're carrying forward some of the threads you discovered in this process, and both of you are doing independent capstones on an aspect of this. Just outline for us how this has inspired you in that respect, and what are you carrying forward into your capstone? Let's start with you, Keren.
Well, I'm looking at women managers' well-being, And I think I'm carrying it forward every day because I am a manager. I have the great fortune of managing many, many women as well, and many of whom are young mothers. And so I'm trying to live this work every day at work and make an impact in the lives of the women who work with me, and also my own life, and to advocate within my organization where I see needs that can be changed.
Good stuff. Dajana, how about you?
Yeah, I also actually have to say that I, knowing the data that I know right now and all the research that we did with Keren, I also look at my own workplace through a different lens. I look at my female coworkers through a different lens, and also it definitely impacted and inspired me to look further into the experiences of East Asian millennial women in corporate America and their very specific experience, but in the context of what we know about, like women of color experience and also like white women experiences in corporate America, because it all comes together at some point. I'm just like very interested in this specific demographic.
Well, I want to thank both of you for your curiosity and your passion around this subject, and especially for giving me such great insights through the independent study that you did with me last fall. I thought this was a remarkable piece of work, and so well done and thoroughly researched. And you clearly have a deep belief in what you're doing here, and you're advocating for something that's so critically important. So thank you for that. And I wish you all the very best as you go forward, carrying this forward into your respective capstones. And I look forward to hearing more about the progress you're making on this front, and continue the work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve.
My guests today were Dajana Dennis-Walters and Keren White, both graduate students in Penn's Organizational Dynamics program. My sincere thanks to Dan Shields for producing today's episode. My name is Steve Hart.